Good afternoon, and welcome to the Capstone presentations of 5 IHC Public Humanities Graduate Fellows. My name is Susan Derwin, and I'm the director of the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center and of the IHC's Public Humanities Graduate Fellows Program. I appreciate that all of you are here today to learn about the work that these 5 fellows have done, and I'm confident that you will be inspired and impressed by their accomplishments. I'd also like to introduce Erin Nerstad, the IHC Associate Director. Erin plays a central and invaluable role in the program. She teaches in the program and she helps to oversee it. Allow me to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located. And I would like to pay respect to elders, past and present, as well as other Indigenous people present. Humanities scholars study all manner of human experience and its documentation. They cultivate the linguistic, analytic, and communicative translation skills needed to do this work and to communicate about it to others. As Sidoni Smith has written, today's academic humanists must be, quote, intellectually nimble, conversant in digital media, networks, archives, and identities. They must be energized by collaboration, flexible in their modes of address, and adept at telling the story about what they do. Increasingly in the 21st century, academic humanists have also embraced the recognition that the most transformative knowledge they can produce is the knowledge that breaks from academic and individualist siloing, is co-created and collaborative, and that emerges in concert with people whose experience and wisdom do not necessarily dwell within the university, but rather in the community. The IHC's Public Humanities Graduate Fellows Program was created precisely for doctoral students in the humanities who want to become such collaborative knowledge makers. It is for students whose studies are grounded less in practice of replication, whereby students are encouraged to imitate their academic mentors, than in a process of transformation, whereby students' learning trajectories are multidirectional and their career opportunities diverse. The Public Humanities Graduate Fellows Program is independent of any single academic department. It brings together PhD students from across the humanities and humanistic social sciences. It builds upon the resulting interdisciplinary synergy through coursework and a practicum that prepares fellows for careers as socially engaged humanists both within and beyond the academy. Fellows in the program complete 2 seminars. The first addresses the history, theories, and methodologies associated with public humanities, studies the emergence and history of the public university, and examines the role of the humanities in democratic engagement. The second course helps students acquire the tools they need to work in the public sphere, including public writing and digital skills, how to work with nonprofits and community partners, grant writing and budget creation, and assessing and communicating humanities impact. In addition to coursework, Public Humanities Fellows complete either an internship or a fellow-designed community project. They work with cultural organizations, governmental offices, nonprofits and NGOs, and K-12 schools. And finally, each fellow participates, how could I forget, in a capstone event, which is happening right now, a public presentation in which they discuss the work they have done in the program and the ways that the work has made a difference in their professional lives. Before we begin our presentations, I want to acknowledge that this program is only able to train students to become public humanities practitioners because each of our partner organizations provides careful mentorship for their interns. We are extremely grateful to these organizations who have so generously and meticulously trained our students. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our first Public Humanities Graduate Fellow, Lauren Smith, who will be joining us via Zoom. Lauren is a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology. Her research focuses on Muslim physical and digital spaces and community belonging in the United States. Welcome, Lauren.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming and for letting me zoom in. As Susan mentioned, my name is Lauren Smith, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology, where I'm working with the local Santa Barbara Muslim community for my dissertation on American Muslim spatial production. While much of my academic work is about physical and emotional spaces, I'm also deeply invested in digital spaces and accessibility, projects that align pretty clearly with issues in public humanities, and that informed my internship with AZ Strut. So AZ Strut, or Arizona Students Recycling Used Technology, is a tax-exempt nonprofit based in Mesa, Arizona, although they serve all of the state of Arizona, particularly low-income, minority, rural, and tribal populations. Strut is a technology access nonprofit. Their work not only provides technology, the physical stuff like laptops, Chromebooks, computers, but also refurbishment, education, and recycling. As of 2020, they were doing something like 7.6 tons of tech recycling per week. Despite Strut's tech bona fides, the organization doesn't have a lot of knowledge about what happens to the tech after it has been distributed, which was where I came in. My public humanities fellow design project ran a small research study with Strut's stakeholders on its SROI, the social return on investment, for its tech distributions. My fellow design project was informed by my coursework in public humanities, particularly in the history and theory course. As you can probably tell by the topic of this presentation, I was really invested in our discussions about the digital humanities, and our Zoom-based classroom created some thorough discussions of applying digital spaces to questions of accessibility and access. I really appreciated the discussions that we had and the camaraderie that developed. But this also reflects the pedagogical issues of considering how digital and public humanities overlap. To mince Dewey, without providing basic material access to educational resources and structures like computers, we do live in a material and digital world. Educators and public-facing academics or researchers can only provide theories of how the world should be, not make concrete change. This thinking informed my final project in the course, thinking through the digital divide or the homework gap, issues of both internet access, since about 35% of low-income Americans lack broadband internet at home, and what UCSB's Amy Gonzalez calls technology maintenance, providing usable material technology, the stuff that can be repaired, reused, refurbished, all these other re's, which is where Strut came in. Over the course of my project, I applied the skill set I developed as an anthropologist and ethnographer to conducting research with nonprofit and education organizations, not only Strut, who were the central focus, but the other stakeholder organizations involved in tech distributions. Honestly, one of the greatest challenges of this project was constantly managing expectations, how to structure a survey questionnaire so more people answer it or pick up the phone, exacerbated when the account set up for the survey was marked as spam, or using a Chicago-based phone number when you know that we all tend to send things to voicemail. This project also became a learning experience for me and Strut, because while it did answer the initial questions that we had about stakeholder perspectives on Strut's tech, it also provided groundwork for future research on these topics at Strut. I learned a lot about the networks of nonprofits that go into work like what Strut does, and the invaluable tools of personal networking in doing this sort of work. One of the more important things that I learned, though, was the practical applications that academic work can be applied as public work. I think we're trained not just in the particular skills like survey distribution or interviewing, but in evaluation and analysis, and that work became invaluable and necessary, especially outside the academy. Which is why one of the reasons why over the course of my time in the Public Humanities Fellowship, I've been much more confident in pursuing non-academic jobs, whether in nonprofit organizations like Strut or other organizations. I really love academia, as hard as it can be to love sometimes, but I have become more confident that the work I can do can be used in other settings as well. It's a nice little confidence boost, I think, at the end of the dissertation. I'm also continuing my work with Strut after this internship as a volunteer. We're working on the next stage of stakeholder research with educators right now. So all this brings me back to what makes a public humanist, or me, a public anthropologist. I alluded to this earlier in discussing experiential learning as pedagogy. I think Dewey says it best by describing every experience as a moving force. Dewey's discussing his philosophy of experience and the holistic engagement between student and world around them. But that experimentation and experiential learning requires willingness to participate in the wider world as teacher and student, which is collaboration. Just like public humanities, tech and digital humanities is collaborative. And I like to hope that what I've learned in this fellowship and in grad school more broadly can help in some way. But that help can't just come from what I think should change, but it also has to come from the organizations that we're working with to quote unquote fix the digital divide by using education and making the materials accessible. And I want to continue to help after I'm done. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Our next presenter is Shannon Toribio, a PhD student in the Department of Religious Studies. Shannon's work focuses on Southeast Asian and Asian American religion, culture, and history. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you for that introduction. Thank you, everyone, for having me here, and thank you, everyone, for being here. Okay, so I'll just jump in. Okay, so last summer, I was afforded the opportunity to intern for the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation. So the Trust have been preserving, restoring, reconstructing, and interpreting historic sites in Santa Barbara, and also promoting the diversity of cultures that have been part of the Central Coast. My time there was mostly involved with the Trust Oral History Project at the Presidio Research Center, working closely with our archivist, Des Alanis. With the Oral History Project, Des and I were documenting oral histories of the Filipino American community in Santa Barbara. The project itself started as a smaller assignment, which was to interview Patty Fuentes-Bantassel. Fortunately, she wasn't able to make it today. But Patty is this Filipino woman who donated materials to the Trust back in 2014. And this is one of the photos from the collection showing Filipino Americans gathering together in Santa Barbara back in 1936. From our conversations with Patty, I learned that her father was one of the founders and the first president of the FCA, the Filipino Community Association of Santa Barbara. Since 2014, Patty's family's artifacts had just been sitting in a folder. And when it came in last summer, someone who's knowledgeable in Filipino American history, that created the perfect opportunity to work together. The Trust saw that opportunity. And it was also a great chance for me to be able to use my knowledge and pursue something within my own academic interests. And I get to learn more about the Filipino American community in Santa Barbara and make a contribution to Santa Barbara's local history. This is the FCA building on 425 State Street, which they've owned since the 50s. But despite being around that long, very little information can be found about them. During my conversations with Patty, she shared with us some contact information of people from the community. We reached out to these people and scheduled interviews. And from meeting these individuals, we were able to collect more and more leads for the Oral History Project. And this is actually the point when I was starting to see that this is becoming a much larger project. This is the Presidio Research Center. And on the left is is part of their library. And in the archives, we now have a living document containing a list of community members that could collaborate with us in documenting Santa Barbara's Filipino American community. My internship already ended, but the Trust asked me to continue working on the project, which I gratefully accepted. I'm still part of the Oral History Project of the Trust. Oral history has long been part of the activities of the Trust. However, certain circumstances, including COVID, has hindered it from continuing such tasks. But this project provided an opportunity to renew the Trust's commitment to oral histories with a focus on underdocumented communities. The project also helped the Presidio Research Center in obtaining more funding, and of course, it also contributed to the archives collections. Okay. The Public Humanities Graduate Fellows Program offered coursework that helped me prepare for this internship. First, in History and Theory of Public Humanities, I learned who the publics are and how to engage them. In Skills for the Public Sphere, I learned to understand the importance of digital tools in reaching out to your audience. Right now, we are working on redesigning our webpage for more accessibility, and we're also strategizing on ways to utilize social media platforms in promoting the Oral History Project. Ultimately, this internship has honed my communication skills in many ways. I reach out to community members and invite them to collaborate with us on this project. But more importantly, to connect with the public and build a lasting relationship. Right. We also inform the public about the project we have been doing. And one of the ways that we do this is through outreach. I serve as an ambassador in local events. And you see in these images that I put together materials when I was tabling for these events. I know our way of communicating works and continues to work because people have been reaching out to us to participate or to learn more about what we have been doing. Des Alanis and I are actually developing a system for the Oral History Project. So we are documenting our entire process. From this internship, I learned how to invite a collaboration and spawn relationships. I've been invited to and attended several community events. I am still in communication with many of our community partners. And because of this established partnership and the system that we're developing for the Oral History Project, we are securing the future of the project. Des has already extended the project to other local communities, not just Filipino Americans. One memory that sticks to mind from this experience was during Patty's first interview, when she urged me to reach out to a friend who she thought would be an ideal person to interview. She told me, contact this person, he does have a history. You can tell him that we're putting a history together. And I think Patty has worded it so well when she said that. Community members were very enthusiastic about the project. Their energy and their willingness to be part of this and their appreciation, this tells us that it is important for people to have their story told and be remembered. And from this internship, I see that public humanities does allow people's stories to be told and recognize that each story is unique and has the power to inspire. To be clear, the Santa Barbara Filipino American community does not need someone like me to create their community. But my work with the community on the Oral History Project helped community members to tell their stories. I've also helped them remember that their shared stories deepen their sense of community, which encouraged them to gather and come together, right, to put history together. Thank you for listening.
All right, our next fellow to present is Maria Carolina Cintura, a PhD student in English. Maria's research brings together the legal humanities, critical university studies, critical race theory, and women of color feminisms to study the discourses constructed around international students and scholars. Welcome, Maria.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for being here. I will present on my fellow design project for this fellowship, in which I designed, researched, scripted, produced, recorded, and released the full first season of a podcast titled Siete Polas, el podcast. You can listen to it wherever you usually listen to podcasts. This podcast features 6 conversational interviews with 12 feminist women who, in all sorts of capacities, have studied feminism and made it a practice and framework of their political, academic, and personal lives. In this first season of the podcast, we touch on subjects such as contraception, aesthetic violence or fat phobia, the academic world, women's participation in politics, religious practices, and romance and relationships. This project emerged as I identified the need to demystify feminism as a theory and as a praxis. As a feminist, activist, and academic myself, I am happy to see feminism and its frameworks increasingly becoming a part of the public conversation of political and legal battles and used as a framework for creating or striking laws and public policy in Latin America, where I'm from. But I also realize that misinformation, prejudice, and gatekeeping make it so that the public at large misunderstands and misrepresents feminist ideals, feminist people, and feminist approaches. So the main objective for this project is to provide our audience with a layered, nuanced, and accessible approach to feminist theories and feminist activism in order to dismantle polarized perspectives, as well as to stage out some of the discussions that we are having in academic and activist settings, and which often become misrepresented or misinterpreted when they make it into the public debate, particularly in Latin America, which is not only where I am from, but where the audience for this podcast is located. As I embarked on this project, there was a community I had and a community I needed. I collaborated with Siete Polas, a feminist collective I started with my friends from college soon after our graduation. That is us back in 2014. Back then, we created a blog that translated feminist theories and practices we had studied into stories, anecdotes, reflections, and even book reviews or movie reviews. And in this way, surprisingly to us, we grew a platform of about 50,000 followers. So my colleagues at Siete Polas are half of the women featured in the podcast, but perhaps most importantly, our digital community of followers informed the design and execution of this project. Indeed, they were the first to express the need for long-form content and analysis informed by feminist perspectives, and this podcast is my response to that need. But like I said, this collective and its digital platform is a community that I had created beforehand. And what I lacked were the technical skills to make this project the high-quality audio program I had imagined. And this mentorship and knowledge is what I found in my community partner, Sillon Studios. Sillon Studios is a women-led podcasting studio in Bogotá, Colombia, my hometown, and they mentored me on the technical aspects of audio recording and coached me through the challenges of designing and delivering interviews and editing episodes from the raw interview to the final released product. As you have probably guessed from what I'm describing, podcasting, especially when you're trying to be the producer, editor, and host, requires this very long list of activities and skills. And it is quite obvious how many of them, for instance, social media management, budgeting, copywriting, are part of the coursework covered in the Skills for the Public Sphere class that we study as part of this fellowship. But also the work in both the skills class and the history and theory class had a central role in helping me conceptualize and then execute this project. First, it was in these classes that I became fully conscious of the need to find and involve a community in a publicly engaged project, that it wasn't just a matter of getting information out there, but really identifying and working at it alongside the communities and partners I spoke about just a minute ago. It is in those classes that I fully grasped the relationship of this project with shaping public opinion and ultimately playing a role in our democracies by helping our audience become critical receivers and more importantly, curators of information, and using that curated information and perspectives to make informed decisions as well as to foster public debate. Of course, the other important skill set needed for this came from being an academic. And at the same time, the biggest challenges I encountered resulted from being an academic. Everything I do as a PhD student, the research, the course design, the teaching, the writing, the public speaking, the multitasking different roles every day was fundamental to my ability to complete this project. But I did have to work through some of the individualistic tendencies that I have developed as an academic. Publicly engaged content production requires and fosters collaboration, opportunities for iteration, and nonlinear growth, which is a way of conceiving of intellectual production that at many times clashed with how I was experienced the paradigm of intellectual production in academia. And so far, I guess the last question to answer is, how do we measure the impact of this project, or how successful this project has been? And yes, I could share stats. I could share the number of downloads, shares, etc. that the podcast has had, or I could share this. This is a text I received from one of the interviewees on our podcast on the day that the episode in which she was featured was released, and it says, "Thank you for helping me start these conversations. This podcast allowed me to experience the joy and the power of the public humanities, which to me is first about putting the resources of the university, both tangible and intangible, in services of fostering necessary conversations, and most importantly, in demonstrating that all experiences and ways of knowing have a stake and a place in public debate. It reminded me that the value of the public humanities and the way that I want to conceive of the public humanities is as a horizontal exchange of skills and knowledges. And yes, that extra S right there is there on purpose as a reminder that indeed everybody who came to this recording, everybody who came to this table was sharing a different skill set and a different way of knowing that well then became Siete Polas, el podcast, which, like I said, you can find wherever you listen to podcasts.
And our next speaker is Heath Pennington, a doctoral candidate in theater, dance, and performance studies with a doctoral emphasis in feminist studies. Heath's dissertation analyzes how kinky cultural productions take imbalances of power rooted in sexual violence and legacy of slavery and retool these forces in complex, negotiated, and consensual public performances. Welcome, Heath.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Susan. My name is Heath Pennington, and my pronouns are they, them, and theirs. And this fall, I completed an internship with the communications team at Santa Barbara-based, internationally reaching humanitarian charity Direct Relief, which culminated my work as an IHC Public Humanities Graduate Fellow. I look forward to speaking briefly about that with you and about other things as well. So in this presentation, I will talk with you about the coursework that I completed and the internship that I undertook as a Public Humanities Graduate Fellow, and then spend a few minutes considering the impact that this program has had and continues to have on me as both a scholar and as a working professional. And also when I think about the value of the public humanities and my own place as a public humanist. My studies are very interdisciplinary and rely heavily on data gathered and knowledge co-produced with practitioner communities. One of the big draws toward the IHC Public Humanities graduate coursework was that I knew that through it, I would learn about topics as varied as the history of land-grant universities, helpful in understanding both North America's legacy of racial inequity as well as the tradition of higher education in this country, and how to work with various communities and nonprofits. While gaining knowledge in the classroom, I also bonded with a cohort of peers who I hope will become my future colleagues. And most importantly for my internship in the Skills for the Public Sphere class, I was able to practice writing and communicating with the public, such as through the article that is thumbnailed here, which I wrote for the course and which was then published on the IHC's blog. Through the Public Humanities Graduate Fellowship, I interned with the communications team at Direct Relief, an international charity headquartered here in Santa Barbara, working to improve the health and livelihood of those impacted by inequalities and crises across national and political lines. When interviewing for the position, I pitched that I wanted to bring a greater focus on climate change to the team's published content on Direct Relief's work. The organization was already committed to publicizing the impacts of changing weather on global health, and I aimed to generate content that would reflect this commitment. I was given great freedom to do so across all aspects and phases of my work, from brainstorming article topics through to writing well-researched, in-depth pieces, interviewing experts for those pieces, and revising the content of those pieces based on feedback from my supervisors, all of which, by the way, drew on skills from the Public Sphere course. During my time at Direct Relief, I generated 5 articles, one of which pens publication awaiting a quote from Direct Relief's CEO. During my internship, some challenges that I faced included writing content for Direct Relief's varied audiences, from national news outlets to local and regional governments, health centers, donors, and concerned publics, as well as scheduling over 15 journalistic interviews, often in varying time zones, with busy people and organizations from the National Association of Community Health Centers to researchers in clinics in India, Puerto Rico, California, as well as a climate researcher at the University of Miami. In addition, aside from a one-day in-office orientation, I worked remotely for the duration of my internship. And for much of that time, I was working from the UK. I needed to ensure that all communications across emails, text messages, and video calls were clear and cogent. Overall, overcoming these challenges enabled me to build interpersonal skills while expanding the scope of my public engagement. In my scholarship, I rely on a number of methodologies such as performance ethnography, embodied practice as research, and feminist qualitative research methods. My experience interviewing and sharing story ideas with so many different people helped me to contextualize my research within a broader public humanities framework that centers collaboration and participation. Looking forward, I anticipate that my public-facing research on gender, sexual, and romantic minorities, as well as knowledge production for and about these communities, will find a home in universities working to support academic freedom. I value how the public humanities enables me to share university tools, such as library databases and research funding, with diverse publics, bringing the academy outward, as well as bringing the interests and voices of these publics into the academy. And these publics include, in my research, performers, as well as people of minoritized sexual and romantic interests. My training as a socially engaged humanist helps me to focus on pressing concerns such as environmental precarity, race and gender conflict, the neoliberalization of the university and our uncertain future, while learning to think with and to collaborate with heterogeneous people and ways of knowing. I consider myself to be a public humanist because in this realm, I have found a place to explore my manifold intellectual interests while discovering the practical applicability of my multifarious skill sets, such as connecting people and connecting with people, as well as researching and writing. Drawing on multiple intelligences and recognizing these intelligences in others, whether within frameworks that are sanctioned by the Academy or not, I see my work as a public humanist as central to my ongoing mission to expand and to include, rather than to delimit and exclude, groups, peoples, and ways of knowing. It's really lovely to be here sharing space with you all and with the other excellent scholars whose work is being recognized today. It was an honor to be selected as a graduate fellow, and I'm grateful to the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center for supporting my public-facing work. It's been my pleasure to be part of this excellent community of public humanists. Thank you so much for listening.
And now we get to hear about the work of Mackenzie Wade, a PhD student in the Department of Anthropology. She studies food perception, the edible insect industry, and efforts towards a more sustainable food system. Welcome, Mackenzie.
Okay, I am very excited to tell you about my experience as a Public Humanities Graduate Fellow and my internship with the Food Bank of Santa Barbara County this summer. So I approached the public humanities through an anthropological lens, and the way that I think of anthropology as really connecting this relationship between broad structures of power and then individuals' lived experiences. And that really lends itself well to the ways that we think about the public humanities. My research within anthropology is focused on the food system, as Susan said, and particularly, as you can see in this picture, insects as food. So my research is thinking about insect eating in human history, the relationship between colonialism and perceptions of insects as food, and also just perceptions of food in general. What do we think of as being edible and good to eat? Or maybe something that, like insects, we often consider them as a non-food, right? And then also efforts of industry stakeholders within the edible insect industry to try to transform American perceptions of insects as food. My work within the public humanities is very related, so I do a lot of public education of food systems. And this has brought me to multiple different levels, so from national to international. Most recently to Egypt for the COP Climate Conference, where I was able to sit on a panel about food systems. But there's something really important missing from this, right? So if we think about food systems on a national and international level, there's a lot of work that needs done, but that work also needs done at the local level too. And up until this point, I had absolutely no engagement with my local food system in Santa Barbara, outside of just being a food consumer like all of us, right? So through the IHC, I was able to hold an internship with the Food Bank of Santa Barbara County. And the food bank's mission is, of course, to make sure that people have access to food in our county, but also that that food is healthy and nutritious food. I entered my internship feeling very prepared for what I was about to undergo, thanks mostly in part to the IHC and the training that I undertook as a fellow. So my training was on the theoretical side as well as the applied side. And we worked on the history of the public humanities, learning about particularly pedagogy related to the public humanities, thinking about the relationship between the university and the public, what does that look like, and especially what does communication look like within that relationship, and also more tangible skills like budgeting and grant writing and thinking about website design and how to design a campaign, which you'll see actually came into play during my internship. So at the food bank, my role was as a marketing fellow, And my main goal was to design and implement the Food Bank's Hunger Action Month campaign, which ran through the month of September. In addition to that campaign, I got to work on a variety of other skills as well. So thinking about the importance of a brand. Has anyone seen the Food Bank's branding around town? Raise your hand. The trucks, yeah, we're all very familiar with it. It's something that they really do a lot of to uphold that brand. Also, diverse writing formats for many different groups that the food bank is working with, including farm workers and children and older adults, thinking about diverse ways of writing and depicting information for these multiple communities. I was able to see the process of developing an annual report and that communication between my team and also outside of the community as well, which I'll show you in a moment. So the really great thing about a marketing internship is that I can actually show you what I produced, right? So the first is my campaign through the month of September, the Hunger Action Month campaign. And we created a calendar so that community members could each day choose an action to engage in food security in their community in some way. So you can see that calendar here. And I know the text is small, but you can also see maybe some of your favorite restaurants listed here as well. So one of the things that I did with the food bank is I partnered with local restaurants, and the restaurants would send a portion of their earnings for that day to the food bank to help support the food bank. And community members who were able could go and dine out at that restaurant and then be giving a portion back to the food bank's work. The other thing that I did with the food bank was help with their website design. So you can see 2 pages here, one on sustainability and the other on the Healthy Farm Workers program that I helped to create. So as I reflect on being a public humanist and my role within the food bank, the way that I think about this is really best exemplified by a story that I was told by my supervisor, who's up here in the corner and unfortunately finishing off a day of jury duty right now. But she showed me the food bank's first logo. And you can see that the logo has food on it because the food bank makes sure people get food. That's obviously very important. But the food bank is so much more than getting food from point A to point B, right? What she showed me is that the food bank is about relationships. And even though my internship was largely online, I did get to go and engage in those relationships myself in person quite a bit throughout my summer. And this is us rescuing food from grocery stores around town and ensuring that it goes into the food bank's warehouse and then gets to people who need it. That's me getting to push a forklift. I was very excited about that. So I got to actually be a part of the relationship building that Haley, the main woman that you're seeing here, is enacting every single day that she's on the job. Between people who are working in the Costco warehouse, the food bank warehouse, the people in the community who are helping fundraise for the food bank, also the people who are receiving the food they need through the food bank. It is really these relationships that are absolutely central to who the food bank is as an organization. And you can actually see that in the food bank's new logo, right? It's not really about food. There's some kind of oranges, right? But it's really people. It's about that relationship. And as I think about my role as a public humanist, but also my role as an educator, both in the public sphere and in academia, and my role as a researcher, this idea of relationships is really, really important because I study the food system, right? But the food system, just like the food bank, is not about food. It's about those relationships between people, between farm workers and consumers and organizations like the food bank, who are really central to the way that the food system runs and works. So I was actually able to put this into action in my own role as an academic as well. So I developed a course that I could create myself and then teach. It was very exciting, my first time. And I created this really cool course that I'm very proud of, where my students were actually able to go into the public themselves, and they interviewed different organizations and colleagues that they are friends with in class, and then also community members about different food system issues that they face in their everyday. And the students worked together in groups, you can see some of them here, to create a social enterprise to address that food system issue. So I was able to bring my skills in the public humanities to my students then, and I think as I look forward to my future in academia, this is something that I'm going to continue to do, really thinking about public engagement in my role as an educator, a researcher, and in the public sphere as well. I'd like to extend a very big thank you to Erin and Susan for all of your work, and to the IHC more broadly, and to the food bank. And I'm going to shout at my parents because they're here. Thanks. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, you all. Thank you so much for that. Just the range and variety and it was just so astonishing. Now, I have a question for each of you, like a quick question, but I find that it is one that can be revelatory of the scope and import of a project, but also of your stance, your approach to it. Okay, so in each of your research areas and in the process of doing your project, what was the most surprising thing? What was the biggest discovery that you made, but along the lines of just being surprising?
I have one immediately. Can you hear me okay? Yes? Okay. Mine is just very, very basic, so I think it'll be a good one to start with. The work week. Was that surprising to you? Because in academia, we work at 5 a.m., we work at 2 in the morning on a Sunday, just no matter what. And I think I don't know about, maybe you have better practices, but I'm sending emails at that time too, and that's super rude. And I think I realized that immediately, that people have a work week and your emails adhere to that work week. And that was revolutionary for me.
Yeah, go for it.
I think my biggest surprise came actually after releasing the podcast. I had envisioned the audience as either people who were already involved in feminist activism or research, or perhaps the younger side of our digital community, who were the ones who were asking for more information, more anecdotes, more personal stories, more ways to connect to feminist theory and praxis. And I actually got a lot more reactions and feedback from people that I had never imagined would have been touched by the podcast, which kind of confirmed my initial intuition that the human side of activism, of academia, of research, of political engagement, which is where a lot of the interviewees were coming from, is what's sometimes missing from the public debate, which is why I chose to use this word of demystifying feminist activism and feminist research, because it so often feels like either it has to be done perfectly in order to count as feminist, or it's something out there that can only be available as an ethical horizon for just certain people. And so I would get texts and I would get emails, and I'm still getting texts and emails from parents, grandparents, a lot of men, cis heterosexual men, who felt like they really needed to see that human side of our feminist engagements. And basically their response was, this was unexpected. Many of them admitted to kind of hate listening to the podcast and then being very surprised by what they found. And that was very surprising for me. They were not in my mind. I was not trying to cater to this audience. But of course, I am very happy that that happened.
Thanks for your question. And thanks for such an inspiring answer, because I want to go off of this as the first thing I'll say is, there were so many surprising things. One of which being the general excitement people had to speak with me as a researcher and as a journalist. And conversely, however, the utter difficulty with which I obtained those interviews after many follow-up emails. But really, I think it was the scope of the audience. Because as I looked at stats about who's accessing news on Direct Relief's website, I found that it's A1 news outlets who are picking up stories and redirecting these and using them for quotes about current events. It's stakeholders, it's donors, it's people in governments from various countries, because Direct Relief's work is very international. And just noticing that and hearing from the communications team just how many inquiries came in every day from so many different stakeholders, that has to be the number one most surprising thing about the internship. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I can definitely relate to the workload. Normally I do my emails at the end of the day, like 2, 4 in the morning. My students can attest to that. But one thing that really surprised me during my experience working on the internship is that, I read a lot already of the literature on Filipino American history, but it's really when you talk to individuals and listen to their individual stories, and you realize that history is not a monolith, and there's all these nuances of these people's experiences, and a lot of them actually work against the grain. It's not the common narrative that you would normally hear or read about from reading history books, and it's just really surprising to me. Like, oh, it's that's not what I read about, but you see that, each story is unique. Yeah.
Lauren, do you want to share? I'll give you a chance to chime in.
Sure. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yep.
Thank you for the question. And to all of everybody else's answers are honestly really inspiring. Even, the work week answer, which is a constant struggle. But I think my work was a lot more on the back end than I think a lot of these, ironically for a public-facing, sorry, my dog is right here. Ironically for a public humanities fellowship, it was very back end for this organization, a lot of what I was doing. And I think something that really surprised me was it's one thing that how much work goes into all of these different elements, but it's another to think about the ways in which, as you're building out a backend, as you're building out a data set, or you're building out the information just of who to contact and whether they prefer email or phone or send somebody to go talk to them. I think that was something that just was constantly surprising me, was how every time I thought I had figured out how much work there had to be done, there was still more to do. And I think that's both kind of terrifying in some ways, but it's also really exciting because there's always something more that you can do out of it.
Thank you.
Thank you all for the great talks. I have a question for Shannon and also for Mackenzie. For Shannon, what kind of items are in this archive? I assume documents, but are there other sort of objects that allow the opportunity to tell history through material culture? And then for Mackenzie, can I please hear more about eating insects?
Are you asking about from the Filipino community? Yeah, so we have, in the collection we have documents. Documents, a lot of it are about the Filipino Community Association. A lot of formal documents, incorporation, that kind of stuff, correspondences from the mayor, from the governor, that kind of stuff. It's a lot of material from their banquet programs back from the 50s. And yeah, there's a lot more materials that we're hoping to acquire from different community members. Like there's this one community member. She has what do you call that? She has a studio in Santa Barbara, and she makes dresses and stuff. And she's planning to donate some of that. And I think that's really great to see all these materials that's also part of Santa Barbara culture. So, and yeah, of course, a lot of photographs. And they shared some of that from the slides. And yeah, we're planning to add more of that stuff in our collection.
All right. Bugs. I could talk all day about eating insects, but I will say that a great thing about the work that I do is that it's not just telling you about eating insects, but you can actually eat some, and there are some here. So after this, we'll go into the reception room, and of course I brought insects. Of course I did. And I'll tell you just a little bit about these insects that you can try if you want to try them. So they're from my fieldwork this summer that I did with my friend Shelby, and she runs a cricket farm in rural Iowa. So she grew up on a corn and soybean farm, and she was, she's really in the heartland of all of the issues around agriculture and sustainability and all these questions. And she just told her parents, I want to do something different. And she started farming her own crickets, and now she's selling to places all over the US. And those are the crickets that we'll be eating. They taste a little bit like sunflower seeds. These are dried and spiced, so they're a little bit, not spicy, but it's her hot flavor, but we always say that they're not spicy enough. So don't get worried if you're not into spicy crickets. Raise your hand real quick. Has anyone had insects before in this room? All right, great. So I'm excited to tell you more, but there's so much to say. So if you want, just come chat with me. I'm always happy to talk about insects.
Well, thank you all for your inspiring talk. And as a public humanities fellow myself, I am really excited to take on my own project or internship. And I'm particularly interested in the internship. So for those of you who did your internship for the program, I'm just wondering, Heath, because you mentioned how you were surprised with the enthusiasm or the excitement of people who wanted to speak with a researcher, right? But I'm also thinking, were there any pushbacks or stereotypes that you walked into the public sphere as researchers or academics? Like, was it always excitement and enthusiasm, or were there some other forms of challenges that you faced as an academic that might not necessarily always be, welcomed in the public sphere, or like vice versa too, like as an academic walking into the public community or sphere, did you find any challenges that, like, this is really different? Like Mackenzie, you mentioned how like the work hours are really different. So I'm just curious, like, what were some of the challenges that you faced in between the differences of academia and the public world?
Well, I can take this one first. And then I'm very curious to hear the answers as well from the other interns. I would say, actually, the one thing that really jumped out at me was that when I started with direct relief, because I mentioned that I was working with writing content about climate change, that it was assumed that my knowledge and my background were going to be in that field. And I think it was kind of almost strange for people in the organization to understand that, okay, I'm coming from a theater and performance studies background, and you are my colleague in my cohort, so you might face the same thing. And I had to say, actually, just because someone has a specialization, right? Like, I'm doing a PhD that's very niche, but I have many other areas of interest and other things that make their way into my research. And then what was great was that because of the training from the 2 courses with the IHC, I could actually talk so much about the interdisciplinary nature of public-facing humanities. And I think that people were eager to learn about that, but at the same time, it was a challenge that I faced. And another challenge, maybe, yes, people were very excited to talk with me,
But I also noticed an assumption of disciplinary knowledge in those fields, so people would just start rattling off jargon about their kilowatt hours of their batteries and their solar generators, and I'd have to say, I love that. Can you tell me? And this is great for me, but also for writing content for a general public. What does that mean? So maybe in a way, I can spin this into a positive because having an interdisciplinary background helps me to reach a broader audience and not just to assume a baseline of knowledge which would come with a certain subject-specific area. Yeah, and I'll stop there.
Who wants to go next? I will. I'm thrusting the mic at you.
Okay. I faced many challenges working on the oral history project with the trust, mostly because there wasn't such project when I came in, and Des and I mentioned Des earlier. Des and I were actually trying to build the project as we go. And like I mentioned earlier, it just really started as one assignment to every Patty, and we really didn't know how to go from there, or we didn't plan it being a bigger task. But when we talked to Patty, and then she told us about all these other people that we should connect with. And then, this is actually, we started just calling it an oral history project, and we started, so the challenge is how do we move on? How do we develop, how do we connect with these people that, we never met with these people, and, they don't really know us either, and how do we breach that gap? Like, how do we present ourselves? How do we, because we have to reach out to these people without sounding like we're selling something, right? We try to present a value to this project that we're doing that is beneficial for everyone. And it still surprises me how well we were received by the community. And after establishing that relationship, it just made everything a lot easier.
I'll just quickly say that my supervisor was just amazing. She was so amazing, and I went into it saying, I'm a marketing intern and I really don't know much about design, and I am terrible on social media and all the things that you would want out of a marketing person. But she was really great at just giving me a job, saying, here's what I want you to do it, and just try your best. And then we would workshop it. And that was just really, really helpful for me. And then she would give me a writing piece, like writing a press release, which I had never written before, but as an academic, she knows that we can write. And that piece, I was like, okay, here's the structure, and I could do that easily. And I felt comfortable with that. And then with the design stuff, I did what I thought looked good, and then we would talk about ways that it could be improved. And she was just really, really amazing at walking me through that process. So I think that is, if you yourself are looking for an internship, when you're interviewing and you're talking to the person who's going to be your supervisor, think about how they might act as a supervisor and what you would learn from them, because I think that's really important too.
I can kind of tag along for that. Sorry. Always kind of awkward zooming into this. But I think kind of combining what Shannon and Kenzie were saying, my project was initially proposed as something that the organization wanted. My supervisor, the woman who became my supervisor, went in with this thinking, okay, this is what we want. And my project ended up kind of answering that, but not really. Like, there's still like a much longer process that we're still working through to answer those questions that we started with. So I think if there's one thing that was really challenging, but is still really rewarding and something I want to keep in mind as I'm going through this, is whatever project that you're starting with, it's going to change in some way, whether it's like what Shannon is saying, where, you know, it's something that wasn't even in the project, or like Kenzie is saying with the supervisor really being your, you know, go-to person. I think that having that learning and continuing that sort of flexibility is really important, especially in public-facing work. And still keeping a goal in mind, but knowing that it's not necessarily going to be the way that you initially thought it was going to be was something I really had to keep reminding myself as I was going through.
As we come to the end of this part of our afternoon, and before we go into our reception, I want to say that we're very fortunate to have Dinah Ramey Berry with us today. She is our new Michael Douglas Dean of Humanities and Fine Arts, a publicly engaged scholar herself, and Dean Berry is going to say a few words, so please help me to welcome her to the IHC.
Thank you, Susan. I really just wanted to say just a few brief remarks and thank all of you for your presentations. I had 1,000 questions myself, but I wanted to say that what I hope that you all saw here was the value of this kind of engagement, engaging beyond the campus walls, right, beyond the academy and in other organizations. And I'm hoping that what came out of this for you is a new set of skills that you can bring. I mean, some of you were talking about coming into fields and organizations that were not at all close to your research for your degrees. So I'm hoping that that's been very helpful. And I also want to encourage you to continue doing work in the public humanities as you go forward beyond the campus, beyond your time here at the university. I'll say just a brief remarks. We created a program similar to this at a previous institution that I was working at, and we did a pilot program that had 10 scholars each year that were working on internships, different organizations, some off campus and some on. And the students walked away with a really, really valuable experience and a set of skills that when they were applying for both academic and non-academic jobs, that set them apart from all the other candidates. So I think you will find this will carry beyond just the skills that you've learned these last 2 quarters. Myself, I became a member. I'm a historian by training, and I always knew that I didn't want to just talk to the 12 or 13 people in my field. I was doing at the time very specialized work on enslaved women. This is back in the 90s when I was in graduate school. And I knew I wanted to talk to a wider audience. So I started off by just like volunteering to give talks through during Black History Month for K through 12 audiences, going to churches, historical societies, small community organizations, and trying to do work within the community. And that was really a part of engagement that enhanced my academic research. So I hope that you guys saw this in a symbiotic way. And I just wanted to say that it was wonderful learning about your projects. And this is an excellent program. And thank you so much, Susan, for bringing this to the campus. Thank you.